Hello to everyone far and near, and welcome to what will now be the final panel of this year's conference. We now have 4 very interesting papers on a range of topics. The first is titled Kim Chunsu's Poetic Toponymy of the Soul, Names as a Symbolic Depiction of Lived Space in Korean Contemporary Poetry. And this paper will address names as rhetorical devices to introduce space in poetry. It's presented today by Elia Rodríguez López, who has a degree in historic philology and Asian studies from the Autonomous University of Barcelona and a PhD in contemporary Korean literature from the Seoul National University. Welcome, Elia.
Good afternoon, or good night in Spain. My name is Elia Rodríguez, and currently I am a Korean lecturer in Salamanca University. First, I would like to thank you for your attendance and the organization for allowing me to present today. My presentation is entitled Kim Chunsu's Poetic Toponymy of the Soul, Name as a Symbolic Depiction of Lived Space in Korean Contemporary Poetry, and focuses on the role that proper names, especially place names, may have as a poetic resource in the work of the Korean poet Kim Chunsu. We will begin with a brief introduction to the significance of place names in Kim Chunsu's work, in conjunction with the theoretical grounds on which the present research is based. Afterward, I will address some specific examples as recommended by the anonymous reviewers, whom I would also like to thank for the excellent comments and suggestions. Kim Chunsu is a South Korean poet who began his career as a writer in post-war Korea within the existential current and the neo-avant-garde that took over from the first literary experimentations of the 1930s. His vast poetic productions spans over 50 years, from his beginning in 1948 until he died in 2004. This wide-ranging work presents an unusual number of place names and other proper names on its pages. Concretely, the study I carried out shows that among a total of 844 published poems, there are 94 different place names related to Korea and 167 foreign place names belonging to the 5 continents, the vast majority referring to Europe or Asia. Many of them appear on more than one occasion. For example, the most frequent place name in his poetry, Seoul, appears up to 27 times, followed by the name given to the sea of his hometown, Hallyeosudo, 18 times, and his birthplace, Tongyeong, 13 times. The most frequently observed foreign names are Spain, 9 times, and Toledo, 9 times too, followed by Tokyo, 8 times, and Siberia, 8 times too. I counted the total amount of 591 toponyms distributed in 319 poems, approximately 38% of the corpus, including names of regions, countries, and cities such as those already mentioned, hydronyms such as Donghae, East Sea, oronyms such as Mon Johan, Johansan, or the Pyrenees, Los Pirineos, and other places such as names of monuments, prisons, or airports. The space represented through these numerous place names in Kim Chunsu's works reveals a mental map of his imaginative world that helps us enter the poet's inner universe, opening up new perspectives on his poetry. Kim Chunsu's interest in the spatial dimension of human life seems to come from a sense of disorientation after the primordial loss of his childhood paradise. The many times either Tongyeong, his native town, or Hallyeosudo appear in his works assure this fact. After leaving that place for the first time, he asked himself, "왜 나는 여기서 이러고 있는가? Why am I doing this here?" An existential question he kept for the rest of his life. In Kim Chunsu's text, we find that it's precisely in disorientation and loss that the self opens up to space and becomes aware of its singularity. Therefore, Kim Chunsu's interest in space is intimately related to an ungrowth self who interrogates his position in the world. After becoming aware of the importance of space for human life, Kim Chunsu imagines and depicts a whole new world in his poems. This world appears full of places and the toponyms that designate and particularize them. But these places are not desert. On the contrary, the numerous characters that inhabit them are often present. This way, the poet extrapolates the existential relationship he has with his hometown to the relationship between the characters and their surroundings. In other words, the space in Kim Chunsu's works is a lived space intimately related to the individual inhabiting it. This space transforms the human experience while being transformed by it at the same time. The experience of a space for an individual is unique and non-transferable. To communicate such experience with others, we must transform it into something, words, pictures that can be shared. So, to emerge in Kim Chunsu's poetry, this sort of experience must become a representation of a concrete place, that is, an image that abstracts the particular characteristics of a given landscape. In this sense, place names represent such an image in the poem by enclosing the uniqueness of a given space and the relationship that people establish with it. As a distinctive concretion of the experience of a specific space, names gather and concentrate the characteristics of a given place and function as a kind of abbreviation of its particularity. Including names in the text implies integrating an extratextual element into an intratextual environment where the name reveals itself as fiction and generates a whole series of unpredictable associations in the reader's mind. Especially in the poetic genre, it usually appears as evocative of symbolic and expressive contents, to the detriment of the traditional narrative function with which it is associated in the novel. Therefore, beyond their referential function, place names are linguistic signs imbued with a specific historical and cultural system, capable of evoking semiotic associations relevant to the interpretation of the literary text. Thus, place names can encompass within themselves countless historical, cultural, geographical, and experiential meanings, all of which the poet uses to build a poetic world of his own. By interpreting Kim Chunsu's poetry through the range of place names that appear in his poems and their relation with space, self, and identity, we can identify the following critical aspects of his poetic universe: the connection between self and space to construct and maintain personal identity, the feeling of having lost the center of life and the longing for the origin, where his existential question takes root, and the importance of place and place names for the artist's creative work. Now, I will illustrate these aspects in detail by analyzing some poems. Human identity seems inseparable from its spatial dimension. Self-identity is bound to particular places because of our active engagement in locality mediates how humans experience the world. All places that constitute our experience affect us in some way or another. However, for many of us, the places of our early life, our origins, are significantly associated with strong feelings, which indicates the founding role of those places in our narrative about ourselves and the establishing of our sense of self-identity. This claim is central to the poetics of Kim Chunsu, where frequently place names take the role of introducing the origin of a poetic object representing the poem. These names link a poetic character or object with a specific space and its features, that is, its physical environment and climate, along with its tradition and culture. By establishing a direct relationship with an object or character's place of origin, place names become a kind of center of reference for their spatial experience. In other words, they do not represent the immediate physical center, the here and now, but the space understood as a vital referent, the place one belongs to, even when one has lost it. In this regard, one of Kim Chunsu's late poems, entitled simply with a question mark, best summarizes his conception of space and its relation to the identity of the individual using place names. Instead of reading aloud the whole poem, in this case and the following ones, I will highlight the parts I focus on in the analysis due to time restrictions. Also, I must apologize in advance for the poor quality of the translation. My native language is neither Korean nor English, so it is difficult for me to entirely grasp the aesthetic sense of the original and translate it properly. I have therefore opted for a fairly literal translation in the hope that it will be enough to attain this presentation's purpose. In this poem, the poetic self wonders about the true nature of an ashtray brought back as a souvenir from a trip to Greece. As the line, "because of its body, it had me fooled for about 10 years," suggests, the poetic self only considered its resemblance to an ashtray when he decided to bring it back to Korea. However, the object's ontology goes beyond its appearance and relates to its place of origin and the space it is inhabiting. The object the poetic self believes to be an ashtray is far away from home in a strange land, misplaced in Korea, unable to be itself. In Korea, that object is an ashtray, but it feels uncomfortable when treated as such. In the poetic self's dream, the ashtray becomes a waterfall, leaving for the sea of his homeland, the agent sea. When the poetic self awakens, the object transformed in the dream and returned to its homeland can no longer be an ashtray. However, since it remains physically in Korea, it cannot recover its former essence. That is why the ashtray becomes a question mark in the poem's title, leaving the poetic self wondering, what is it? The loss of its existential center, Greece or the Aegean Sea, and the displacement towards an unknown place motivates the object, the ashtray, to inquire about its true essence. We can observe this aspect when the poetic object asks, why am I here? A question that reminds us of the one Kim Chunsu asked in turn to himself in his autobiographical novel, as noted before. We can observe this aspect when the poetic object asks, why am I here? A question that reminds us of the one Kim Chunsu asked in turn to himself in his autobiographical novel, as noted before. It can be deduced, then, that for the poem, the essence of being, her identity, has to do more with her place of origin and the space in which she finds herself than with her physical characteristics. Similarly, the following poem touches upon this last point through a biographical reference to the author. The poem portrays an Australian missionary who settled with his family in Kim Chunsu's hometown, Tongyong, and ran the nursery school that Kim Chunsu used to attend in his early childhood. Noting that the Australian missionary's family had their sun and wind brought from Australia, Kim Chunsu highlights the idea that the meaningful space is an indivisible part of the individual, constituting the center of existence even though we no longer inhabit it. The image of a natural landscape that one always carries with herself expresses poetically how that family is bounded to its place of origin. This way, the poem is based on the intuition that being born and raised in a specific place makes that place part of oneself and one's identity. However, such an intuition will be much more difficult to introduce in the poem without mentioning the place name, which thus becomes a summary of all that families experience in Australia. Therefore, place names in these two poems, Greece, the Aegean Sea, Korea, and Australia, are crucial to establishing the relationship between the poetic object and its place of origin and inquiring about self-identity in conjunction with an inhabited space. As we could observe in the previous poems, names can represent a connection with the origin or an existential center that in some way one always carries on because it constitutes part of our identity. However, in Kim Chunsu's work, there is also a sense of loss of that central space that translates into nostalgia or longing for return, which the poet tries to introduce with the assistance of proper names. Through disoriented characters who have lost their existential center and the place names associated with them, Kim Chunsu depicts the human being as a lonely and lost creature who longs for a connection with others, hoping to recover that missing center. In this poem, Kim Chunsu brings back the figure of Jiwi, one of the tales of Shilla era. According to the legend, Jiwi, madly in love with Queen Sondok, supposedly waits for her at the Buddhist temple Yongmyosa, replaced by Heinsa in the poem. However, he falls asleep, and the meeting does not take place. As a result, he is consumed and eventually becomes a spirit of fire. Although the existential center for Jiwi is Queen Sondok and not a space, the temple where he must wait for her occupies a central position both in the legend and in the poem that can be read almost as a metonymy of that frustrated love. In this regard, the names of the Heinsa Temple and the Chongno Crossroads in the modern city of Seoul suggest, in just two words, a series of evident oppositions between myth and history, tradition and modernity. Jiwi is torn between two choices. On the one hand, he can go to Heinsa Temple, which here represents Buddhist tradition and by analogy Queen Sondok and the center of his life. But on the other hand, the temple image is eclipsed right away by that of Chongno. This way, Jiwi is expelled from his legend to yearn for love where he cannot find it, in the middle of a big city. Finally, Jiwi, who should end up becoming a fire spirit because of his ardent love for the queen, loses the vital center of his existence and ends up instead, wet with rain and night, feverish and shivering in the modernity symbolized by the central avenues of the city of Seoul. When transferred to the poet's own experience, the loss of the center leads to nostalgia. In this poem, the poetic self recalls spending his adolescence in Seoul, feeling nostalgic for his hometown, a longing he expresses indirectly through a young poetic self who spends his time going over the lines of Tongyong on the map while hearing a sort of acoustic hallucination, the sound of the waterbirds of his hometown. The poetic self feels nostalgia for an intimate and concrete space. The coastline that delimits Tongyong and its innumerable slopes are not those of a place located in some coordinates in space, as it appears on the map, but those of an intimate place in his memory. That is precisely why he can asseverate that the map is a special concept. As such, the map only serves to locate places in abstract coordinates that express nothing about uniqueness and character. However, for the poetic self devoid of the landscape of his childhood, the map becomes a means of expressing his nostalgia, allowing him to approach that intimate and singular space through imagination. If, as we have seen so far, the landscape of the place of origin is something that we always carry with ourselves and shapes our identity, it is logical to consider that it also influences the poet's artistic creation. That is the last point I would like to introduce briefly in this presentation. In Kim Chunsu's work, it is easy to find reference to several artists located in those places where they gave life to their creations. For example, Pek Diol in Shilla, Joan Miró in Mallorca, or Lee Jun-sop in Seowipo in Jeju-do. While mentioning them and the place names where they inhabit, Kim Chunsu shows his thoughts about art and the ideal artist, and uncovers the importance of space, which in these cases does not always coincide with the homeland, as the center of experience from which the artist must start to create a new reality. The same subject will appear in his later poems, but now concerning the poet's biographical circumstances, in which Tongyong and its geography will take on great prominence again. Although his hometown is an essential part of his identity, we must remember that it's also the poet's way out into the world and his first contact with a particular community and its traditions. As personal memory and identity are tied to a specific space and region, cultural memory and its identity also relate to a specific territory and landscape. For this reason, his hometown is both something personal and shared with a community. In the following poem, the poetic self longs to reunite with a generation of artists who, like him, strive to create something new from within that community, its tradition, and its culture. In the poem, the poetic self recalls those days in Tongyong he spent with the musician Yoon Sang and the painter Jong Hyun Nim. Both artists have in common with Kim Chunsu that they sought to integrate traditional Korean culture with modernity and the new artistic currents from the West in their works. They share with the poet their place of origin and the fact of being part of the same artistic movement in which Kim Chunsu placed his literary creation. Although all three incorporated Western influences into their work, the poet emphasizes Tongyong and its local tradition as the starting point for their artistic creation. To this end, he resorts to names of places hardly known to those who are not inhabitants of that region. Thus, John Isang's music used to take a rest at Mount Nammang's foothills, and painter Jong Hyun Nim saw a rock ptarmigan for the first time at Myeonjeongji's well, and only look at the mural paintings of Yonghwasa Temple. The creations of these artists intermingle with local space introduced through place names. This way, using specific names underlines the relation between art and the artist's homeland and secures, at the same time, a local culture that also includes the knowledge of the proper names of that place. Through these examples, I hope to have been able to demonstrate the importance of place names in Kim Chunsu's poetic work and their enormous symbolic potential to introduce aspects related to the identity of the individual, the feelings of love as a central space for one's life, and the importance that Kim Chunsu gave to the experience of space and the place names that name it as a fundamental influence from which artistic creation starts. Since restrictions of time have forced me to leave many topics unexplained and some points might require further clarification, I am at your disposal for any doubts or suggestions during the allotted time for questions. I leave here the main reference used for this presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Elia, thank you. That was fascinating. And it's the first time in this conference that we've had an opportunity to consider poetry and onomastics and poetry. Louisa has a question.
Okay, thank you for this presentation. Really fascinating, and so I'm intrigued by the relationship between toponyms and literature. I was wondering whether, considering the existential dimension you point to, you have kind of given special meanings to places and spaces, because I've seen that you mention quite often space and place. So I was wondering about that. And also, you collected so many names, place names, from the poems you have analyzed. And I was wondering whether you have noticed any relationship between Korean place names and place names from other countries, I mean, foreign place names. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the questions. I'm not sure if I understood well the first one. I think that you mean that why I use a space and place, the both, without like making any distinction. I guess is that question. I think it's a very important one, actually. My work is basically based in, for example, in the work of Malpass or Ralph, who actually uses place and only use place. But every time that I use only place, like not everybody understands well what I wanted to say, because they use place as a philosophical term, an existential term, an ontological term. So it means that then I have to explain so many things in the background. So instead of that, I actually did that also I only use a place, I think, for, I don't remember very well, but I think that I got some comments in the reviewers too about this topic. So I just, in order to simplify, I prefer to use both like nouns. And especially because in Spanish, actually, there's not that much difference from, well, I mean, there is a difference, place and space, but sometimes it sounds very natural for me to say space. And in Korean, where I did my dissertation, this is actually part of my dissertation, actually, my advisor didn't like the word chanso, that is the name for place in Korean, for the connotations that it had in Korean, that it has in Korean. So it's kind of a difficult topic, but yes, I'm based actually in the kind of like philosophical term place, not space. And that's for the first question. And the second question, if there is a difference in usage about between the Korean names and foreign names, I think. And yes,
whether they are associated with different dimensions.
Yes, they are associated with different dimensions. He uses, when like talking about Korean names, Korean place names, are mostly are more likely to be related to his life in Soho. Like, for example, Seoul, he lived in Seoul for many years. So Seoul appears like many times is actually the one who appeared most times in his poetry. And also Tongyeong and all the places related to Tongyeong, not only Tongyeong, but very specific places, like names of very small mountains, or some places that you only will know if you live there. But even if you're Korean, maybe you don't know exactly where that mountain is if you don't live there. And also like or sometimes maybe names that have like some relevance in Korean literature, like Chirisan or something, like another name of a mountain. Or mythical names, like names related to myths, to Korean myths, in Soho. But for foreign names, it's different. Like actually, the like Korean researchers only about the foreign names only pointed out that they use that foreign names for expressing a kind of a cosmopolitism or being exotic. But I think that there is a lot more to, like, I think like some examples that they give this impression too. So yes, but there are this kind of thing of being wanting to be part of the world, wanting to situate him between modernity and tradition, and that's why he also needs or uses these foreign names to situate himself in the world, I think. Thank you very much for the questions.
Thank you. Dorothy has a question, and Dorothy, you've posted in chat, but you're here. How about if you would like to present it? Are you unmuting?
I am.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
All right. Hi, everyone. I don't know if you can see my maps behind me. I'm surrounded by maps in my home office, and I love place names on maps. But I wanted to ask you, I've got two questions. First, personal names and place names often intersect in English. Is that true in Korean? For instance, a surname may be a derivation of a toponym. So like your last name basically says, I am Joe from, Ruston. Are surnames drawn from place names in Korean?
Well, I don't know about nicknames. I don't know that much about that topic. It's not my topic of research, but Korean names have a very little amount of surnames, actually.
Okay.
There's only
Okay.
Kim and Park and Chong and Han, and there is a list of surnames, possible surnames. And so no,
So it's
yeah,
a finite list then.
yes, but at the same time, it's important that when you're, for example, a Kim, you are a Kim of some place. So this is kind of interesting. So there are so many Kims, a lot of Kims, but then you're a Kim of blah blah of whatever place. And then when you find another Kim, you can ask him, you are a Kim from where are you a Kim? And it's
Right. So that
the relation
place name provides more information about that person.
Exactly.
Okay. So, and this is a follow-up question. I really liked your idea of place names functioning as part of a character's existential center. And I was wondering, is that unique to the Korean pilots you've explored, or do you think that might be universal in all literatures, that place names become part of our existential identity as characters, but perhaps as people too?
In my opinion, I think it's universal. I mean, of course, I focus on Korean poetry, but I think that if we research enough, we can find something similar in other poets from around the world. I think it's possible, and also because all these, at least all my theoretical frame, it comes from Western thinkers, and which also say that this kind of existential relationship with place and with place, I will say place, not the space here, but with place is kind of universal and is part of human beings. And I think all can more or less can agree with that. That doesn't mean that we are determined by our birthplace, but that we have a kind of connection with that place, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to both of us for leaving us on the note of the universal.